3, this is going to be a short one, but I just wanted to specifically talk about the two tools we're going to use all semester long to illustrate these points. The first tool is supply and demand. And as you can see by the graph, the supply curve is upward sloping, which means the higher the price, the more of some product they're willing to supply if it's a producer. And the demand curve is downward sloping, which means the cheaper the price, the more you're going to demand for that product. So the idea is, if you look at the supply and demand curve, you will see that that represents, the way I think about it for the supply curve, it represents the minimum that a seller is willing to accept, starting at the lowest amount to the highest amount. So the people to the left of the red dotted line on the supply curve are people who are going to sell because their minimum willingness to accept is low. And people to the right are not going to be selling because their price is too high. On the demand curve, I think about it the other way. Starting again to the left, I think about it as the maximum willingness to pay, starting out at a high level that falls down to a low level. So now the people who are willing to pay the most are going to buy it, and those who are not willing to pay the price are not. They're out of the market. So if you look at that graph, and if you haven't looked at supply and demand before, we're going to go into some detail in a couple lectures from now. The idea is just that represents, in aggregate, all the producers who are supplying, let's say, beer again, and it represents the minimum they're willing to sell at. Some people are high-cost producers, which is why their minimum price is high, and some people are low-cost producers, which is why their minimum willingness to accept is low. And we just aggregate them up as a line. The demand curve, then again, if you think about it that way, you are just aggregating all the buyers for this particular product from high to low. And what the intersection of that line represents is the market clearing price and quantity. That is the price that shows up when you go to the grocery store or you go to the Ranger to buy Busch Light. There's a price per 6-pack, and that price is based on supply and demand. Here's what we're willing to sell this light beer for. Here's what we're willing to pay for this light beer. And that price emerges from the interaction of the buyers and the sellers. And this is how we illustrate it. And what the P star then represents is the price when you go into the store. The Q star then represents how much of the quantity is sold. Now, price times quantity would be that rectangle there, which would include area B and then the area to the right. But that's not what we consider to be economic value. What we consider to be economic value is the area A and B, what we call consumer and producer surplus. So again, like I said before, what that area A represents is the buyers were willing to pay a whole lot more than P star, and they didn't have to because the market supplied the good at P star. So that is the value to the buyers. They've freed up a bunch of resources. Area B represents producer surplus. Those sellers were willing to sell for a whole lot less, but they didn't have to. They were able to sell at P star. So in fact, they received more than their minimum, which allows them to spend it on whatever they want to spend it on, including research and development. So area A and B represent economic value. And that might be a little hard getting your head wrapped around at this time, but we're going to go to a detailed example to show you why that's what we consider to be the win-win when we talk about economics, A plus B. The next tool we're going to use a lot, on and off, is strategic behavior. And you may have seen this style of uh, game theory, normal form game theory box before, in which you've got us and them. Do we cooperate or not? And the payoffs to us and them in each cell. And you can see if we both cooperate, we both get 100. If us does not cooperate and them does cooperate, us gets 120 and them gets minus 10. And vice versa in the other diagonal. Or if we both choose not to cooperate, we get 0. And so that helps illustrate why, when you're thinking of a game in which there's a strategic behavior, even though we know that the best place to be, the place which has created most value, is to cooperate, because 100 plus 100, which would be like A plus B, is 200. That's the biggest size pie to society. Well, what happens is we get stuck in the lower southeastern cell, the Nash equilibrium there, at 0, 0. Neither of us benefit because we don't cooperate. Now, the Nash equilibrium in this case is called the Nash equilibrium, named after John Nash in the movie A Beautiful Mind, if you've ever seen that, with the idea that it's a trap. If I cooperate and you don't, you make 120, which is better than 100. So you're always tempted not to cooperate when I cooperate. Well, the same with me. If you cooperate and I don't, I make 120 over 100. And so my temptation is not to cooperate either. So if we both follow our temptations, we are stuck at 0, 0, because neither one of us wants to change on our own, because we end up with minus 10 if you don't change, or I end up with minus 10, or you end up with minus 10 if neither of us changes. Again, we'll go through this Nash equilibrium in more detail throughout the semester to get an idea what's what. But you should expect to see either a supply and demand graph or this strategic behavior graph, or this graph represented by benefits and costs, a very similar graph to the supply and demand graph. So we're going to work through these tools. We're going to use them. Try to understand them as best you can now in terms of getting a good idea of them. But I will go into more detail than you maybe want to hear about them to try to understand how an economist thinks, because these two tools help us frame a problem. So when you're thinking about your quiz questions, your candidate quiz questions, the supply and demand graph is going to help you frame the problem. The strategic behavior graph might instead be the tool that describes the problem you're trying to get at. One of these two tools, or this one as a marginal benefit, marginal cost tool, they're really just fundamental to understand social interactions and how you gain value through trade. So what we'll do is go into detail on those. But for lecture 2, what we're going to jump to is just an overview of the global economy. So what it looks like, what it means pre-COVID, post-COVID, during COVID, but just an idea of the size of the global economy, the size of the U.S., the size of China, all in relationship to what we're looking at. So that is lecture 1 in 3 parts. You got questions on them, write them down and email them to me. And if they're common enough, I will email them to the group. And I will probably send you a couple readings to help you position this a little bit better in your mind. And again, anytime you got any questions, you just email me and we'll get after it.